In a region like Cartago, where concrete fades into forest and dusk settles faster than memory, a missing girl isn't just a matter for the local precinct. It's a fracture in the everyday rhythm of a place that rarely makes national news. On March 4th, 2020, 18-year-old Allison Pamela Bonilla Vasquez left her boyfriend's home shortly before nightfall and was never seen again. She lived just 15 minutes away. She never arrived. There was no breaking glass, no alarm, no desperate 911 call. What followed was silence, too much of it. Her phone stopped transmitting location data at 9:12 p.m. Her usual walking route was unlit but familiar, winding past small grocery stores, dense shrubs, and a row of properties bordered by chain-link fencing. Local police initially classified it as a routine disappearance, the kind they expected to resolve within 48 hours. It wasn't. By 7 a.m. the next morning, her mother, Patricia Vasquez, called the station. She reported that Allison had not returned home, her bed had not been slept in, and her phone rang until it didn't. A municipal officer responded to the call, conducted a perimeter search of the path Allison typically walked, and recovered one item of interest, a broken red hair tie lying in the gravel, partially buried. No blood, no drag marks, no obvious struggle. What stood out was what wasn't there. The investigative unit, led by Officer Luis Morales, a 15-year veteran of rural violent crimes, arrived by 9:30 a.m. He walked the same route Allison should have walked, twice. There were tire treads from multiple vehicles, but no clear signs of a confrontation. The problem wasn't what we found, Morales later wrote in his report. It was what we didn't find, and how neatly that absence was arranged. By the third hour of daylight, Allison's disappearance was classified as suspicious. It became clear this wasn't a case of a runaway teen. She left no note. She made no withdrawal. Her last phone message, sent to her boyfriend Harold Segura at 8:58 p.m., read, "A man's been walking behind me for a few blocks now. Probably nothing." That message changed the tone of the investigation. Detectives began canvassing the area, questioning store owners, security guards, and neighbors along her known path. A bakery 2 blocks from Harold's apartment had a surveillance camera pointing toward the road. The footage from that night showed a blurry silhouette walking behind Allison approximately 40 seconds after she passed. No identifiable features. The figure moved slower, deliberately, and stayed roughly 20 feet behind her until both exited the camera's field of view at 9:05 p.m. The footage was time-stamped, verified, and backed up, but the video cut out suddenly at 9:07 p.m., resumed 3 minutes later with an empty frame. It wasn't erased, it glitched, or that was the story from the shop owner. Either way, the crucial minutes were gone. Technical analysts later confirmed the video file was fragmented due to power fluctuation. It wasn't sabotage, it was coincidence. But the timing was wrong, or maybe too right. Meanwhile, search teams were dispatched by noon. The wooded areas between Ujaras and Paraiso were combed by volunteers and K9 units. Nothing turned up, not even a scent trail. Her phone, disconnected from network coverage shortly after her last text, pinged one last time on a cell tower near the San Geronimo de Cachi Ridge, an area infrequently traveled and home to an abandoned municipal waste site. Morales requested aerial scans of that region, beginning with the old landfill perimeter. At this point, the theory leaned toward abduction. There was no digital trail, no debit card usage, no Uber ride, no social media login. Her academic records were spotless, no known enemies, no recent arguments, no mental health flags. The working profile was low-risk victim, snatched in a high-risk environment. At 3:42 p.m., forensic technicians analyzed the red hair tie and recovered minor epithelial cells under a black light. DNA analysis was requested, prioritized, and rushed. Results would take 3 days. Inside Allison's room, nothing was taken. Her school books were still open. There were no signs of forced entry, no notes, no messages, just a calendar with a circled date. March 5th, literature essay due. Investigators photographed everything. Officer Morales returned to the gravel path at nightfall. He paced the same stretch, under the same dim lighting, with a forensic technician. When asked what struck him most, he replied, "This place doesn't look like where someone dies." That's exactly why someone would choose it. Back at the station, the early case summary painted a clean picture, too clean. Allison walked into the night and vanished between 2 fixed security cameras, neither of which caught the actual event. Her phone died within 20 minutes. No one heard screams. No one saw her enter a vehicle, but someone followed her. That much was clear. And whoever it was had done this before, or planned to. The area surrounding Ujaras wasn't heavily trafficked. It had narrow paths, patchy lighting, and stretches of undeveloped hillside where signal coverage dipped in and out. The terrain was uneven, scattered with overgrowth, rusted fencing, and isolated plots that bordered the old San Geronimo landfill, a decommissioned dump site that had become a ghost zone after being shut down a decade prior. Most locals avoided it. Allison Bonilla's last known phone signal originated from within 800 meters of that location. At 6:45, the morning after Allison's disappearance, Lieutenant Luis Morales requested 2 search units to cover the route between her boyfriend's apartment and the ping zone. A K-9 team was deployed with handlers from the Judicial Investigation Unit. Initial passes yielded no scent track. The terrain was too contaminated with prior foot traffic from volunteer searchers, family members, and press already on site. At 9:13 a.m., forensic technician Carla Mendez logged the first anomaly: shallow tire depressions at the base of a gravel incline northeast of the landfill fence. The impressions were fresh, irregular in spacing, and matched a non-commercial tread pattern, possibly from a motorcycle or compact utility vehicle. GPS coordinates were flagged and a perimeter was marked. Nearby, a torn plastic bag was caught under a root cluster. Inside were organic debris, a piece of torn fabric, and what appeared to be a small gold-colored stud earring. The forensic analysis report issued later that evening confirmed the fabric matched the interior lining of a school backpack brand carried by Allison. The earring matched the description provided by her mother, one of a pair Allison wore nearly every day. Trace epithelial samples were extracted from the earring base and submitted for comparative DNA profiling. Morales noted the spatial proximity between the discarded item and the tire marks. No drag pattern, no blood pool, no obvious signs of physical altercation, but the evidence trail was too centralized to be dismissed as incidental. "Objects don't cluster in clean lines without guidance," he remarked. "Either someone placed them, or someone knew what they were doing." At 11:06 a.m., officers extended the search grid to the southern ridge of the landfill perimeter. An old concrete drainage trench, partially collapsed, held more plastic debris, snack wrappers, scrap metal, and a stained nylon cord approximately 70 centimeters long. Analysis showed environmental wear consistent with exposure over 12-18 hours. The cord was bagged and logged, though no immediate connection to the case was established. By mid-afternoon, Morales reviewed the cellular coverage logs. The final signal from Allison's phone didn't triangulate from the landfill directly, but close enough to justify focus. The timing, location, and evidence flow aligned, but too precisely. "The signal stops at the edge of a terrain where no one goes, and the first thing we find is a personal item. That's not a coincidence," he stated in his report. At 16:42, a neighbor from a farm near the ridge came forward. He claimed to have heard what he described as a short scream between 9:15 and 9:20 p.m. on March 4th. The noise, he said, came from the eastern rise behind the landfill fence. He didn't report it earlier because he assumed it was a wild animal. Morales logged the statement but flagged it as inconsistent. The timeline would place that noise at least 3 minutes after Allison's phone cut out. The team returned to the ridge with updated drone support, mapping thermal signatures and recent ground disturbances. In a depression near the landfill gate, partially obscured by ferns and debris, a small smear of reddish-brown residue was found on a rock. Field testing indicated it was not blood. It was clay, tainted with oxidized iron, consistent with local soil types, but visually misleading. The forensic discovery that shifted the investigation came at 1911. A separate K-9 unit, sweeping a blind slope to the southwest, signaled a soft alert. There, embedded beneath the underbrush, was a broken elastic band with traces of what appeared to be skin oil and crushed soil. The object was photographed, cataloged, and later linked via DNA to both Allison and an unidentified male donor. The dual profile was partial, but it marked the first confirmed trace of secondary contact. What struck Morales wasn't the object. It was how tightly the evidence converged within a limited radius, despite expansive surrounding terrain. "In most dump sites, you lose trails," he noted. "This one funneled us toward the middle. That's what bothered me." The case file now included 5 physical pieces: a hair tie, fabric scrap, earring, cord, and elastic band, all logged within a 5-hour window. The question was no longer if Allison had been there. It was why the trail ended so cleanly. At 2043, Morales submitted a formal request to reclassify the case under the Aggravated Disappearance Protocol, which elevated its priority status within national law enforcement frameworks. A protected warrant was issued for the cellular metadata of surrounding residents within a 1-kilometer radius of the landfill. Morales didn't name a suspect. Not yet. But his suspicion was clear. The next step was to determine which signals had remained active after Allison's phone went dark. By the morning of March 6th, the investigative focus narrowed to a single quadrant of terrain near the decommissioned landfill. The recovered objects, the torn fabric, gold earring, and elastic band, formed a forensic corridor less than 300 meters wide. That corridor cut across the edge of a small residential sector, occupied by 5 homes and 1 agricultural storage unit. According to satellite mapping and local utility records, only 2 properties had direct line of sight to the elevation where the search teams found the partial DNA match. At 10:08 a.m., lead investigator Luis Morales returned to that area with 2 additional officers. They conducted structured interviews with each resident. The 5th door belonged to a 28-year-old man named Nelson Sanchez. He lived alone in a modest single-room unit with reinforced mesh windows and a lockable exterior gate. No prior criminal history. No employment record in the past 18 months. According to municipal files, he had inherited the property from a deceased uncle 3 years prior. Sanchez answered the door calmly, declined entry to the officers, but agreed to answer questions on his porch. He confirmed he was aware of the disappearance, but claimed to have been home alone on the night of March 4th. He said he fell asleep around 9 p.m., didn't hear anything unusual, and hadn't spoken to Allison in over a year. Morales asked how he knew the exact night in question. Sanchez replied, "It's all over the news." The exchange lasted under 12 minutes. Sanchez gave verbal consent for investigators to observe his yard and outer structures, but declined a search of his interior space without a warrant. Officers documented the interaction, noted no visible scratches or defensive wounds, and left without incident. Later that day, background checks indicated that Sanchez had been disciplined twice in high school for inappropriate conduct toward female classmates. Both incidents were classified as verbal harassment. No charges were filed. In 2019, a neighbor submitted a complaint to local police, alleging that Sanchez had been loitering near her property line late at night. Again, no action was taken due to lack of evidence. Morales re-reviewed digital maps of the search zone. One detail stood out. The window from Sanchez's unit overlooked the landfill trail at a direct angle of 63 degrees. In low light, a person from that vantage point could see pedestrian movement along the path where Allison was last recorded. That view was unobstructed. On March 7th, a technical unit conducted a wireless signal sweep of the area. The data revealed that Sanchez's device had been active during the time frame of the disappearance, connected to a home Wi-Fi signal until 8:47 p.m., and then offline until 1:06 a.m. the next day. The gap aligned too neatly with the window of disappearance. Morales flagged it in the case log. A follow-up interview was scheduled for the next morning. This time, Sanchez appeared less composed. He remained outside, but kept glancing toward the interior of his home. When asked again about his whereabouts, he repeated his prior statement: home alone, fell asleep early. Morales didn't contradict him. Instead, he introduced a subtle inconsistency. "You said you went to bed around 9. Your Wi-Fi history shows you were offline after 8:47 p.m. That's not exactly the same." Sanchez paused, then shrugged. Without a warrant, nothing further could be done at that point. But the foundation was shifting. Forensic officers returned to the search zone, this time with cadaver dogs trained to detect chemical compounds released during decomposition. At 14:22 p.m., one K9 gave a light alert near a depression 40 meters downslope from the landfill's perimeter. No remains were visible, but soil samples were collected. Preliminary spectrometry showed elevated levels of nitrogen and hemoglobin traces. A second set of samples was sent to a separate lab for blind verification. Meanwhile, digital forensics continued mapping mobile activity from surrounding devices. One signal, a burner phone activated for less than 4 days, had pinged 3 towers between Ujaras and the landfill during the week of Allison's disappearance. The last trace was at 9:19 p.m. on March 4th. The device was never used again. Subscriber identity? Unknown. The team began cross-referencing local purchases of prepaid SIM cards within a 30-day window. Surveillance footage from a mini-mart dated March 2nd showed a man buying a card in cash. His face was partially visible under a baseball cap. Height, build, and gait were consistent with Sanchez. The footage was secured. At 18:03 on March 8th, the DNA report on the elastic band returned a partial match, 96% consistency with Allison Bonilla and one unknown male contributor. The male profile did not yet match anyone in the national database, but it was now clear that the object had evidentiary value and indicated physical proximity between Allison and a second party during the time window in question. The final entry in Morales' daily report was brief. Interviewed adjacent residents, all cooperative except Sanchez, claims home alone, no witnesses, Wi-Fi disconnect aligns with victim's last known movements, uncooperative with voluntary search, no cause for arrest yet. There was now a person of interest, not a suspect, not officially, but someone who was watching, and perhaps closer to the trail than anyone else realized. The forensic priority shifted on March 9th, not because of a new witness, but because of a digital inconsistency uncovered during routine cell tower data review. Analysts at the OIJ's cyber unit were tasked with extracting and mapping all mobile signal activity within a 1-kilometer radius of Allison Bonilla's last known coordinates. Their primary objective: identify any devices that registered movement patterns inconsistent with local routines during the night of March 4th. Out of over 300 devices logged between 8 p.m. and midnight, only one stood out. A temporary prepaid mobile number, active for exactly 92 hours, had pinged 3 separate towers during the disappearance window. It moved from the town center near Harold Segura's apartment, trailed southeast across the outskirts, then disconnected precisely at 9:19 p.m. near the same ridge where the evidence trail ended. That phone never transmitted another signal. No outgoing calls, no texts, no further activity. The number was unregistered. No name, no ID. The SIM had been purchased in cash 2 days earlier at a convenience store 11 kilometers away. Surveillance footage from the store was obtained. The time-stamped video showed a man wearing a cap and a zipped hoodie, purchasing a SIM pack and single-use charger with coins and a folded bill. His facial features weren't fully visible, but his posture, gait, and build raised internal red flags. The footage was compared to known local profiles. Investigators logged a physical correlation with Nelson Sanchez, including shoulder alignment, estimated height, and left leg stride deviation. The comparison wasn't enough for an arrest, but it validated the decision to escalate Sanchez's digital audit. Morales filed for a telecommunications warrant authorizing a full review of Sanchez's internet activity and associated devices. That warrant was granted at 11:17 a.m., limited to the prior 2 weeks. On inspection, metadata revealed Sanchez's home Wi-Fi router had recorded a manual disconnect at 8:47 p.m. on March 4th. This corroborated prior findings, but a deeper system log showed something new. A secondary device, previously undetected, had accessed the router 3 times between March 2nd and March 4th under a masked MAC address. This tactic was known to cyber units. It mimics random hardware identifiers to avoid direct tracing, not common behavior for casual users. Each session lasted under 10 minutes. No browsing history was stored. This indicated deliberate use of cloak technology to avoid detection. At 2:30 p.m., officers returned to the trail area with updated grid coordinates based on the last ping from the burner phone. The location placed the device within 40 meters of the depression where the K9 unit had triggered 2 days earlier. Further excavation in that area revealed no human remains, but several items were retrieved: a crushed pen casing, a half-burned matchbook, and a torn paper receipt partially illegible due to moisture damage. Chemical analysis confirmed the matchbook had been struck recently. The receipt, once enhanced through forensic imaging, revealed a partial store logo and a date, March 4. Inside Sanchez's residence, officers identified a matching matchbook from the same local vendor. Though circumstantial, the alignment of physical and digital traces was mounting. Morales logged the update and requested a forensic psychologist to begin behavioral profiling. Parallel to the fieldwork, a forensic soil analyst completed testing on the samples from the slope area. 3 of the 9 samples tested positive for elevated levels of sodium nitrate and cellular hemoglobin byproduct, indicators consistent with decomposition or fluid exposure. The findings did not confirm the presence of a body, but they reinforced the theory that something biologically significant had occurred at that site, within a 36-hour time frame prior to recovery. Morales noted the timeline compression, a silent phone, a disconnected router, a new burner, soil traces pointing to possible decomposition, and all of it concentrated within a span of 3 square blocks. But there was still no body, no murder weapon, no confession. He reviewed the caseboard in silence that evening, each item pinned up with stringed connections, photo, text log, object map, and yet the sum total still lacked the final layer of physical confirmation. Evidence was stacking, but it wasn't locking. In cases like this, the tipping point often came not from the big discoveries, but the small variables that resisted narrative alignment. The data didn't just seem too clean anymore, it was starting to look engineered. By March 10th, the case file on Alison Bonilla had shifted from a disappearance to a targeted, high-risk criminal investigation, with 4 separate forensic links circling the same geographic point and a mounting stack of digital irregularities. Lieutenant Morales authorized a second formal interview with Nelson Sanchez. This time, the objective wasn't just observation, it was pressure. The request wasn't random. Over the past 48 hours, Sanchez's behavior had subtly changed. He stopped responding to investigators' courtesy calls. His house lights remained off during usual waking hours. Garbage pickup records showed no waste disposal from his residence in over a week. These weren't criminal indicators on their own, but in the context of a forensic net tightening around a person of interest, it meant one thing: he was watching them watch him. At 8:15 a.m., Morales arrived at the station with a printed breakdown, location-based signal triangulation, forensic match summaries, and time-stamped router disconnect logs. Each line item was precise, nothing speculative. These weren't theories, they were patterns. Sanchez arrived at 10:07 a.m., flanked by a public defender. He didn't object to the meeting but maintained a flat tone. When asked again where he was the night of March 4th, he repeated, "I was home, I fell asleep early." Morales placed a document in front of him, network logs showing his router's manual disconnection. He didn't respond. Rather than escalate, Morales shifted tactics. He moved from timeline to environment. He referenced the earring, the elastic band, and the matchbook, all found within walking distance of Sanchez's back property. He never accused. He simply presented. Sanchez glanced at the paper stack, but his composure remained fixed. When asked if he ever walked the trail behind the landfill, he said no. When asked if he'd ever used a prepaid phone, he shook his head. His attorney advised silence on further questions. The interview ended with no confession. But Morales noted a first break: eye movement, clenched jaw, delayed answers. These were human, not procedural, indicators that pressure was landing. Outside the room, the forensic team was moving faster. The soil sample from the landfill depression had completed its second-stage analysis. Though it still did not confirm the presence of a body, it revealed microbial anomalies consistent with organic fluid decay. These were not present in control samples from nearby areas. Whatever happened there, it wasn't natural runoff or industrial waste. A new order was filed that day, a limited search warrant for Sanchez's outdoor property. The judicial branch approved it based on cumulative probable cause, citing material trace consistency, behavioral inconsistency, and digital red flags. The search was scheduled for March 11th, 7:30 a.m. Meanwhile, a lab update returned on the torn receipt found near the K9 alert zone. Using chemical imaging and partial text reconstruction, technicians identified the remaining store logo. It matched a local chain where Sanchez had previously been observed. Same store as the burner SIM card purchase. The date matched March 4th. A register number and partial transaction code aligned with a receipt issued at 8:39 p.m. That purchase was recorded: 1 matchbook, 1 chocolate bar, and a 2-liter bottle of water. A timeline check revealed this matched the estimated departure window when Allison left Harold's apartment. At this point, the data was no longer circumstantial. It was coordinated. The cracks weren't in Sanchez's story. They were in his silence. And the more he tried to maintain that silence, the louder the data became. The warrant execution began at precisely 7:30 a.m. on March 11. It was a limited operation, focused only on the exterior perimeter of Nelson Sanchez's property, including the back garden, drainage ditch, and a narrow service corridor that bordered a disused irrigation trench. Officers from the Judicial Investigation Unit accompanied forensic technicians and a canine team trained in cadaver detection. The plan was systematic. The trench zone had been surveyed via drone imaging the previous day. A thermal differential in the southwest corner suggested prior ground disturbance. likely within the past 2 weeks. That's where the team began. At 8:14 a.m., one of the dogs gave a passive alert. The soil area, approximately 1 meter by 2 meters, showed compression inconsistent with natural erosion. The site was cordoned, flagged, and excavation commenced. Within minutes, fragments of cloth, degraded tissue, and partial bone material were recovered. A strong odor of decomposition was present. The remains were bagged, tagged, and transported to the National Forensic Lab under chain of custody protocol. The team remained on site until the full quadrant was cleared. Investigators also recovered a buried, rusted machete wrapped in plastic sheeting. Its blade was corroded but intact. Trace sampling was conducted on site. Presumptive tests indicated the presence of dried blood. Full analysis was scheduled for priority processing. At 13:40 that same day, forensic pathologists confirmed the remains were human. Dental records, provided by Allison's family 2 weeks earlier, were forwarded for comparison. The dental profile matched. Remains belonged to Allison Pamela Bonilla. The confirmation triggered the next legal step. At 15:03, Sanchez was taken into custody without incident. He was informed of the forensic match, the warrant results, and his right to remain silent. He initially refused to speak. An attorney was provided. That evening, a partial confession was recorded. Sanchez stated that he had an encounter with Allison near the Ridge Trail, that she had resisted, and that things went bad. He declined to provide details on motive, method, or planning. He said only that he panicked and disposed of the body near his property. When asked about the machete, he gave no response. His demeanor remained passive throughout. The confession wasn't complete. It lacked motive. It lacked detail, but it was enough for prosecutorial authorization. Formal charges were filed under Costa Rica's aggravated homicide statute. Public reaction was immediate and volatile. Allison's case had garnered widespread attention. The confirmation of her death and the proximity of her body to a known local sparked public protests outside the courthouse and calls for sentencing reform. Journalists camped near Sanchez's residence. The story ran across all major networks within 24 hours. Morales didn't comment publicly, but internally his report was clear. Sanchez's movements, devices, and behavioral patterns had created a traceable sequence. That sequence, combined with layered forensic markers, had narrowed a field of uncertainty into a single point of culpability. There was no longer doubt about what had happened, only about how much of it had been planned. The physical evidence had narrowed the narrative, but proving premeditation required more than a confession. It needed structure, sequence, and forensic validation of intent. The confession given by Nelson Sanchez was vague, deliberately so. It acknowledged contact and acknowledged disposal, but stopped short of providing context. That gap became the prosecution's next objective. By March 14th, the forensic lab completed initial analysis of the machete recovered from Sanchez's yard. The blood traces on the blade were confirmed to match Allison Bonilla through mitochondrial DNA comparison. Additional scraping from the handle revealed a partial fingerprint. It was degraded, likely due to moisture exposure and time, but loop and ridge patterns were sufficient for positive association. The print belonged to Sanchez. Further tests revealed skin cell residue beneath the rubber grip, consistent with forced compression, suggesting the machete had been held tightly for a prolonged period, likely during impact. Investigators reconstructed a probable timeline. Using Allison's last known location at Harold Segura's apartment and the burner phone's movement, analysts estimated a 22-minute window in which Sanchez would have had time to intercept her near the trail. The time of impact, based on decomposition estimates and the state of the remains, likely occurred between 9:10 and 9:25 p.m. Environmental mapping supported this. A section of the landfill path passed within 12 meters of a thicketed blind spot, dense brush shielded by elevation and inaccessible to vehicles. That blind spot connected directly to the rear of Sanchez's property through an informal footpath used by agricultural workers. It was not visible on public maps. A local farmer later confirmed that Sanchez was known to use the path to avoid traffic when walking into town. This revelation shifted the investigation. The proximity wasn't coincidence, it was convenience, and it established geographic opportunity. Next came the behavioral profile. A court-authorized forensic psychologist reviewed Sanchez's academic history, employment records, and disciplinary reports. The findings painted a consistent behavioral pattern. passive-aggressive isolation, authority resistance, and documented misogynistic ideation from high school onward. He had no social media presence, no personal relationships on record. His internet usage, obtained through the digital warrant, revealed a pattern of browsing violence-themed content in the weeks prior to Allison's disappearance, including amateur posts related to weapon concealment and body disposal methods. The evidence was no longer circumstantial, it was contextual. On March 16th, forensic botanists completed trace analysis of Allison's clothing. Micropollen samples on her outer jacket matched plant species located only in the southern section of Sanchez's property. Soil remnants embedded in the fabric were chemically identical to a sample taken from the irrigation trench. These were not transfer contaminants from the landfill trail. They were post-mortem deposits indicating she had been moved or stored after death. These findings supported a single theory. Allison had been attacked near the ridge trail, fatally wounded, and moved through the unregistered path to Sanchez's rear property, where her body was concealed. The machete wasn't incidental. It was part of a coordinated act. With each forensic layer added, tool residue, environmental pollen, digital patterns, the legal framing began to harden. Prosecutors amended the charge sheet to include premeditated homicide, obstruction of justice, and unauthorized disposal of human remains. By the third week of March, the National Court scheduled Sanchez's preliminary hearing. The case had shifted from a missing person to a calculated act of violence. But what remained elusive, what still lacked resolution, was motive. Sanchez refused to elaborate. The forensic record, however, spoke louder than his silence. March 25, 2020. The courtroom in Cartago province was at capacity by 8 a.m. Uniformed officers controlled the perimeter while members of the public, many holding signs with Allison Bonilla's name, waited in silence. This wasn't a trial by spectacle, it was procedural, clean, controlled. Costa Rican law permitted limited public access during pre-trial hearings, but this case had shifted expectations. The press was granted a single camera feed. There would be no dramatization, only record. Nelson Sanchez entered in plain clothes, wrists cuffed at the waist. His face was expressionless. Since his arrest 2 weeks prior, he had not given another statement. No interviews, no explanation, just silence. The prosecution presented first. Their approach was methodical. Timeline established through tower data, sequence of victim movement, forensic alignment of recovered physical evidence. They detailed each data point without repetition, no flourish, no emotion, just structured escalation. Dental match confirmed the remains. Machete tested positive for the victim's DNA and the defendant's partial print. Cellular records showed the burner phone path mirroring the victim's last known location. Wi-Fi router logs corroborated a deliberate attempt to disconnect surveillance access. Clothing fibers and soil on the victim matched Sanchez's property. Each point was backed by lab documentation, time-stamped video, and sworn statements. Forensic pathologist Dr. Alvarez delivered the most technical segment. He confirmed the injuries were consistent with repeated blunt and sharp trauma to the cranial vault, likely delivered in a rapid sequence. He could not confirm the exact order of blows due to post-mortem degradation, but indicated intent was unequivocally homicidal. The defense did not contest the findings. Instead, they challenged procedural timing, arguing that body recovery had compromised decomposition analysis. But this argument held little weight against the volume and coherence of forensic sequencing. The judge acknowledged Sanchez's right to remain silent, but noted the absence of counter-narrative. Without direct rebuttal, the court accepted the presented evidence as uncontested. Pre-trial hearing concluded. Sanchez was bound over for trial. On April 3rd, under public pressure and a fast-track docket, the criminal tribunal delivered its verdict. Guilty, aggravated homicide with concealment. Sentence, 18 years, the maximum allowable under local statute at the time. No possibility of early release. There were no outbursts, no protests inside the courtroom, only the sound of chairs scraping as Allison's parents stood when the sentence was read. Her mother did not speak to the press. Her father's only words were brief. She wasn't just a student, she was our daughter. That's all people need to remember. The broader impact of the case stretched beyond the verdict. Within weeks, national legislators proposed revisions to Costa Rica's penal code for femicide-related crimes. The case triggered educational institutions to expand reporting systems for stalking and harassment. Forensic labs received additional funding for rural area deployment. But the name Allison Bonilla carried a weight that didn't belong to policy. It became symbolic of a void no legal process could restore. The final report filed by the OIJ was clear and unembellished. It listed chain of evidence, sequential recovery, confession index, and judicial outcome. It closed with the classification, case status, adjudicated, no further action pending. But outside the record, the story had already settled deeper. In the streets of Paraiso, her photo was still taped to bus stops. Her name had become part of the local fabric. And in the forensic archives of a country that rarely forgot its missing, Allison's case was now permanent. Not just closed, etched. I've spent the last chapters walking you through a case that left a scar on an entire community. And if there's one thing I've learned from revisiting Allison Bonilla's story, it's that silence protects no one. We often think danger is something distant, something you'll see coming. But more often, it wears a familiar face, walks a familiar path. As someone who's followed these cases closely, I believe we each carry a responsibility to speak out, to report what feels wrong, to protect one another beyond fear or hesitation. Justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts in everyday awareness. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's something this case made you reflect on? Do you believe your community would act fast enough in a similar situation? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, how this story impacted you, or even what you'd want changed in your local justice system. And if this story moved you, if it made you stop and think even for a second, please subscribe to the channel. That one click helps bring more stories like this to light. And if you didn't connect with the video, let me know why. Was it the story, the style? And where in the world are you tuning in from? I read every comment. Let's keep the conversation going.